I hate to say this, but Comfey is no good unless you're just starting the game in the last few weeks and you haven't yet got a corn farmer. If you do, and you're following this mono ingredient meta, I don't see a reason that you will need a Comfey. So if you want to catch one just for completion's sake, by all means. Besides that, this doesn't actually change with Comfey's arrival. Just so I don't bore the people who have been following me for a long time, we'll talk about this in the second part of the video. In the first part of the video, I'm going to explain why Comfey is no good, unless you're just brand new to the game. First of all, Comfey is an ingredient specialist, and its main ingredient, the base level ingredient, is corn. Because Comfey is available at both Greengrass and Cyan Beach, it is the only way for a new player to access corn. Otherwise, you would have to wait until Lakeside is unlocked and catch a Beware. Besides corn, Comfey can also farm ginger. I'm not going to talk about the third ingredient, cacao, as I normally don't in any of my videos because level 60 is not unlocked, but also the third ingredient that is only unlockable at level 60 doesn't help us with the mono ingredient builds. Now the first thing you might notice is that for an ingredient specialist, usually you get more ingredients per production, which is not surprising. But in terms of the amount of ingredient drops, Comfey is up there. It can drop 2, 5, 7 corn, 6 and 9 ginger, which is the highest I've seen, or 7 cacao at level 60. In fact, the 6 and 9 is higher than Tyranitar. At Tyranitar's level 30 and 60, it only does 5 and 7. So does that mean that Comfey can actually beat Tyranitar if we ignore the fact that Tyranitar does level 1 ginger? And how about corn? Comfey does 2, 5 and 7 corn. This is Beware. Beware also does 2, 5 and 7 corn. How does it compare to Beware? As you all should know by now though, just looking at the number of ingredient drops is not enough. We also have to look at the speed of the Pokemon to know how quickly it's going to produce those ingredients, and also the ingredient rate. The ingredient rate tells us every time a production is triggered whether the Pokemon is going to drop berries or ingredients. And we will prefer ingredients usually for an ingredient specialist because they do more ingredients than other specialists. Interestingly enough, Comfey with a 41 minute and 40 second frequency is actually faster than both Beware, which is at 46, and Tyranitar, which is at 45 base frequency. Unfortunately, no matter how fast a Pokemon is, if its ingredient rate is low, it's just mostly going to be farming one berry at a time, which is both worse than another ingredient specialist or worse than a berry specialist. So this is where the ingredient rate comes in, and you can see that Tyranitar is at a respectable 27% ingredient rate. So about a quarter of the time, it's going to farm ingredients, whereas Comfey only does it 13.9% of the time. Now the exclamation mark here means that we're still waiting on more user data to verify this rate, but as far as I'm concerned, these rates are pretty accurate. RainNX uses the RP model to determine the rates of the Pokemon. And again, if we compare to Beware, Beware's also got a higher ingredient rate than Comfey. So if we do account for both the speed, the ingredient rate, and the number of ingredients dropped, how do these Pokemon fare against each other? And before we do that, let me just show you that Comfey, amongst all of the current ingredient specialists, has the lowest ingredient rate, even worse than Gengar, which means it really needs to make up for it in the amounts dropped and its speed. Unfortunately though, when we do look at Comfey, so we're going to give Comfey triple corn as a start, and we'll remove Tyranitar for now. If we do compare Comfey in terms of the amount of corn farmed compared to a Beware also having triple corn, at level 50, Comfey will only on average farm about 34 corn and Beware significantly more at 52 corn. Yes, because of the faster speed and lower ingredient rate, there will be more berries farmed, but that's not the focus of an ingredient specialist anyway. The numbers are actually not that as important as the relative amount. So the difference between 52 and 34, making Beware about 50% better than Comfey in terms of corn farming. Not to mention, Beware has higher inventory, which is desirable if you don't log in very often, whereas Comfey, you might need some inventory sub-skills, especially if you've got 9 gingers that you can drop at level 60. But in my opinion, Comfey is not a good long-term investment anyway, so taking it to level 60 doesn't make that much sense to me. Now, how about we compare it to Tyranitar? So let's take a look at Triple Ginger Tyranitar, and we're going to switch out the corn for double ginger. Let's say you've already invested in a Beware with triple corn, so you don't want Comfey to be doing corn. You want it to be doing something else, let's say ginger, as its focus. Maybe you never found a good Larvitar, which by the way should be easier to do than finding a good Comfey. But let's say you never found a good Larvitar, or perhaps you invested in the wrong Larvitar like myself, who went with a ginger bean ginger option. Can Comfey help with ginger farming? So once again, if we scroll down, Tyranitar farms 64 gingers, whereas Comfey only farms about 30 gingers. Even if we pretend that Comfey had ginger at level 1 and add the 10 corn into this number, we're still nowhere near Tyranitar's ginger farming abilities. However, if you made a mistake in investment like me, I didn't go with a mono Tyranitar, I went with a beans Tyranitar, then Comfey at level 30 with ginger does beat Tyranitar in ginger farming. So in a niche situation like mine, where you actually made a mistake with investing Tyranitar, Comfey can actually cover for the gingers. However, one thing that Comfey does do better than Tyranitar is that Tyranitar is self-healing, so if you gave Tyranitar level 6 healing, so charge energy S at 43 heals per trigger, it's actually a lot of waste because Tyranitar will just stay at 150% energy all day. It will just hit the cap. Whereas Comfey's skill, Energizing Cheer, has a higher chance to heal a teammate that is of the lowest energy since the last update, which is a really nice buff. Now the data on this is actually still rolling in, but thanks to the Leafeon enjoyers in the Sleep Math Cord, we now have a pretty decent understanding of how likely this skill would trigger on the lowest energy Pokemon on your team. And we're talking about a greater than 50% of the time. In fact, based on current data, it looks like Energizing Cheer triggers 60% of the time on the lowest energy Pokemon on your team. Which, if you ask me, is a lot less energy wastage than just Tyranitar healing itself constantly over and over again, which is also why Umbreon is one of the worst skill specialists in the game. Because it does heal itself a lot, however, there's no point of going above 150, so all of that energy just gets wasted. Though to be fair, it only triggers about 1.5 times a day with neutral stats. And you wouldn't really go for a skill build for a Comfey, which is an ingredient specialist, so I can't see this number going up by much. In fact, if you compare its stats to other Pokemon with the same skill, Energizing Cheer, Comfey actually ranks at the bottom. To be fair though, all of these other guys are skill specialists, which generally speaking, we say that they trigger about twice as much as somebody who isn't a skill specialist. So even if we do multiply this 1.7 by 2, 3.4, Comfey would still be slightly worse than Slowking and Leafeon, which are at the top of this Energizing Cheer skill. Additionally, Comfey cannot evolve, so you get one less skill level, so all of these other Pokemon are going to be cheaper to invest on the same skill. So Energizing Cheer on an ingredient specialist is still a nice skill because it helps bolster the rest of your team. But because it's not focused on doing Energizing Cheer, it's not going to be worth your main seeds to invest. In other words, it's going to stay at a pretty low level, probably for the rest of the game. But if you do happen to get a nice Comfey with good ingredient stats and it just so happens to have skill level up M, that's not a bad thing at all. It's just that you wouldn't focus on using Comfey for its skill. You should be swapping out an ingredient specialist who's done farming the ingredients that you need so that you can run berry specialists. So for example, Clefable, who can provide 2 or 3 berries instead. So considering that a good ingredient specialist shouldn't be staying on the team that long, it also doesn't make sense to be investing main seeds in this skill, even though it is good. If you really want this skill to be good, go with a Slowking instead. So back to the ingredient comparison, one more Pokemon we should have a look at is the possibility of running a triple ginger Kangaskhan. who also farms more gingers than Comfey. So even if we compare Comfey to a worse ginger farmer than Tyranitar, Kangaskhan, Comfey still doesn't beat it. So in my opinion, there are only two situations you would use Comfey. One is you haven't unlocked corn and you don't have a Stuffle, or you never caught a good one during the Lapis Lakeside event. Then Comfey, hopefully with at least double corn, ideally triple corn, although double is enough considering that you'll one day switch to a triple corn beware. You probably won't go to level 60 on the Comfey anyway. Then it's a good idea to get a Comfey so that you can start making some strong dishes that require corn. And the second situation is a little bit like myself, where you made some early investments like a Beans Tyranitar, so you don't really have a ginger farmer, and maybe Kangaskhan just hasn't appeared a lot for you, so you haven't got a triple ginger Kangaskhan. Then Comfey can help you by being a level 30, maybe even level 60 ginger farmer. Although, to be fair, in my situation where I have a ginger, beans, ginger Tyranitar, if we actually force the calculator to work out what level 60 is going to produce, now bear in mind that I don't like doing this because a lot of things can change by the time level 60 is released. We only do this out of extrapolation, but the data can change, the rates can change by the time level 60 comes along. But if we extrapolate the data and make Tyranitar level 60 and also make Comfey level 60, Tyranitar in total still makes more ginger than Comfey. In other words, by the time level 60 comes along, I still don't really need a Comfey when I could run a Tyranitar. But if your situation is that you've got ginger, beans, and then beans again, or sausage, then a double ginger Comfey may help you relieve your ginger problem. Especially considering that Comfey has boosted rate to spawn during this event, you might have better odds of farming one of these than a Kangaskhan instead. Besides these two situations and the fact that you really shouldn't invest all your main seeds in a nice skill but is on an ingredient specialist that you shouldn't be putting on the field that much, I would much rather this skill on a berry specialist that I can use a lot, or a skill specialist. Then in those situations, I might actually consider using main seeds. So I guess the good news is, you don't really need to hunt a Comfey. And given that it requires 16 friendship bars to fill to catch a Comfey, I think that's actually good news. So for the advanced players or long-term players, this is actually the end of the video. But for those of you who are just starting out and have no idea why I'm talking about mono ingredient meta, why I only choose the same ingredients in all three slots, we're going to go through mono ingredient specialists one more time. So basically we're going through this video that I did several months back again, but with Comfey in the picture. So this is part 2 of this video. When we say mono ingredient meta, this is just something that people have gotten used to saying over time. It doesn't actually have a defined definition until today. So I'm going to give it a definition now. What exactly is mono ingredient meta? This phrase actually means two main things. Just bear in mind that we are only talking about ingredient specialists here. We're not talking about other specialists. Other specialists can have whatever ingredients they want. It doesn't bother me. But mono ingredient meta is to say that you have this exact same ingredients in all three slots of the ingredient list. Unless, of course, the ingredient can never be at level 1, so for example, potatoes, then this kind of situation is also part of the mono ingredient meta, where potatoes are farmed at level 30 and 60. So some Pokemon actually have two possible outcomes for the mono ingredient meta to work. Kangaskhan can be mono ginger, or it can be mono potato. And the reason why it's meta is because you will always get the ingredient that you need. Let's say you've got 3 of the 4 ingredients farmed by berry and skill specialists for a certain dish. Let's take green grass salad for example. If you have a Walrein, Feraligatr, and Wiggly that does enough oil and they're always on your team, and then you've got a Victory Bell that does these 2 ingredients, then all you're missing is corn. A triple corn beware or a mono corn beware is going to be the best at making this dish for you. Now, at the start of the game, a lot of people argue that having mixed ingredient specialists were the best. That's because if you have one Pokemon that does 2 ingredients, let's say a Blastoise that does milk and cacao, and then a Victory Bell that does tomato and potato, then you just need to run those 2 Pokemon permanently on the team, and you should be able to cook this dish. Unfortunately, where that theory falls through is when a new dish gets introduced and it power creeps this dish, then having the exact right ingredients for this dish is probably not going to be exactly right for the new dish. But also, the ratio of farming these ingredients are never going to be exactly the same. Victory Bell does 4 potatoes and 2 tomatoes at level 30 and level 10, and you can see that it's not 4:2 in the ratio here. You're going to be under farming that tomato, which means you need to swap in a mono tomato ingredient specialist anyway in order to complete this dish. So while it might sound nice to run mixed ingredient specialists, you're still going to need mono ingredient specialists to cover for ingredients that you couldn't farm. And you can almost never farm too much for a mono ingredient specialist, because if you do end up farming way too much tomato, you should be swapping out for something else that can farm another ingredient that you need. And if you happen to have one Pokemon for every ingredient like this list here, ignoring Absol for now, so if you have Mono Honey Venusaur, Mono Sausage Charizard, Mono Ginger Tyranitar, so basically mono ingredient for every single ingredient, and you don't overlap, otherwise you're going to have to invest the same Pokemon twice. For example, if you did have an Apple Absol and a Cacao Absol, that's going to be a problem. You just won't have enough candies to be able to make both good. Then you almost never have any wastage, because when you do use that Pokemon, you only use it just enough to get what you need, and then you swap it out. And if you've got enough ingredients to make whatever dish you need, then it's time to run Berry Specialist instead. So there is absolutely no wastage at all. Now, this list was made based on my last video, and it still hasn't budged. We haven't changed how we look at these ingredient specialists at all since. Besides the fact that we can now add Comfey as an alternative corn farmer if you don't have Beware, or Comfey as an alternative ginger farmer if you don't have Tyranitar or Kangaskhan, or maybe you made mistakes investing earlier on like myself, this list has largely remained the same. So the second major point of what mono ingredient meta is, besides the fact that the Pokemon itself has to farm only that ingredient unless it's a rare ingredient like mushroom, tails, leek, and potato, what also defines the mono ingredient meta is that you don't have any overlaps of what a Pokemon species will do. Yes, Victory Bell can actually do tomatoes as well as a triple tomato farmer, but if you end up having to invest in 2 Victory Bell, I think we all know how hard it is by now to level up Pokemon in this game to its max level. On top of that, you need to start saving materials for when future level caps get unlocked. It just doesn't make sense to have Victory Bell, even though it's better than Mr. Mime, do both tomatoes and potatoes. But then you could argue that if your Victory Bell did tomatoes, and it can, you can swap these 2 roles, you could have Golem to do potato. But then there's no one else that does beans at level 1. So Golem is the only beans farmer that can be mono beans, which then forces the potato back to either Victory Bell or Mr. Mime. The reason why I picked Mr. Mime as the tomato farmer is because out of all current tomato farmers, which are Abomasnow, Mr. Mime, Victory Bell, Mr. Mime doesn't have as much of a unique role and is not as good as Victory Bell overall. So I gave the better of the 2 ingredient specialists the role of potato, which is harder to farm. But where possible, I still recommend most people to aim for this list to have mono ingredient meta, which means least wastage when you're making dishes, but also least wastage on your resources so that you don't have to invest the same Pokemon for 2 different ingredients, leading you to run out of candies for that Pokemon. Where the honorable mention alternatives come in is if you haven't got a good one of this list. So for example, Delibird is very rare, so to get a triple egg Delibird is very difficult, which makes Abomasnow's role in making eggs at level 30 and level 60, despite it not doing it at base level, quite important. So I actually personally run an Abomasnow for eggs, while I hunt for a mono egg Delibird. The cacao situation is also pretty unique because Absol is the only one that does it at base level. So to be truly mono cacao, you have to use Absol. But Absol again is quite rare. So if you're just starting out the game, you're going to have trouble farming cacao, which is very important for desserts. So you'll probably end up using a cacao Blastoise, a Blastoise that has level 30 cacao in order to complete certain dishes, which is a problem. There is no one else besides Blastoise that can do milk amongst ingredient specialists. For skill specialists, we do have evolutions and weirdly enough, Persian that can do milk, which is why I normally recommend people if all else is held the same, to go for a triple milk evolution. Of course, deciding on skill specialists shouldn't be based on ingredients. It just helps you farming milk when Blastoise might have to take the role of cacao. And one more weird fact is that if we make it level 60, there's only one other Pokemon that can do milk. At level 60, Arcanine can also do milk, a Pokemon that we rarely talk about. So that finally leaves us with what's going on with apples. There is not a single ingredient specialist right now that does apples at base level. No one really talks about it, but the reason why that is the case is probably related to, well, firstly, Pikachu, which is the starter Pokemon the game gives you, does apple at base level. But also, maybe to keep up the Pokego Plus sales, apples are not farmed by ingredient specialists at base level, since Nightcap Pikachu can do apples, although admittedly not very well. So if we must focus on an apple farmer, which of the three that can do apples at level 30, Pinsir, Delibird, and Absol, should be the main apple farmer? Bearing in mind though that I don't actually recommend Delibird because ideally you go with a triple egg Delibird. So out of the three apple farmers at level 30, Absol is the one that does the most, at 39 apples compared to 36 and 38 for Pinsir and Delibird. So the difference is actually not huge. So where you can, I would say go with a triple cacao Absol, triple egg Delibird, and then let Pinsir do the apple farming, since the role of making honey can be replaced by Venusaur. So that is how you use this chart, which is available under quick guides on my Discord. And that is what mono ingredient meta actually means. It doesn't mean what it sounds like at first. It doesn't mean that for each Pokemon, you need to have all three ingredients exactly the same in its ingredient list. It means you need to think about which Pokemon should cover which role. And although this is the goal of the mono ingredient meta, not everyone is going to achieve this in the end. Many people will have to compromise because they either didn't think about this at the start, so in other words, like myself, invested in a beans Tyranitar instead of a ginger Tyranitar. Then what will end up happening is that you got to push the role of farming ginger to someone else. So I personally have to look for a triple ginger Kangaskhan, or maybe a double ginger Comfey. For other people, and this is a common one, a sausage ginger Charizard as opposed to triple sausage Charizard means that you'll have to push the role of doing sausage to someone else. Maybe Beware, but then if Beware has to do sausages, then Comfey will have to come in and cover for the corn. I wouldn't push the role of corn to Dragonite, because if you do, then Gengar will have to cover for herbs. But if Gengar covers for herbs, there's literally no one else that does mushrooms in terms of ingredient specialists. So even with Comfey's release, this list remains stable. Of course, if things change in the future and we get more ingredient specialists added or new ingredients being added, then this list will have to move around. Now, there are some problems of running a mono ingredient Pokemon list. For example, mono ingredient is one of the hardest list of ingredients to get, and that's because the odds of you landing the same ingredient at level 30 to level 1 is actually not half. Strangely enough, there's only 1/3 of the chance that you'll land cacao again for an Absol. 2/3 of the time you're actually going to get apples. So if you're seeing a lot of this, cacao apple, or cacao apple mushroom, or cacao apple for an Absol, that's normal. To get cacao Absol, there's only a 1 in 9 chance. Whereas getting a cacao apple is actually a 2 in 9 chance. So as long as you're happy to keep farming until you get mono ingredient, that shouldn't be a problem. The second subsequent problem, rolling on from that, is that if you happen to roll that 1 in 9 chance and have cacao for an Absol, for example, then most people will want to look at the stats and go, are the stats worth investing in? The sub-skill and the nature. And if it isn't, do we have to wait for another 1 in 9 Absol that actually has triple cacao? And I'm going to say that mono ingredient is probably more important than the sub-skills. And I'm going to say that if you have the right ingredient list, it can actually be better than multiple good sub-skills added together. Let me explain why. Let's say you're looking for honey and all you have is a Venusaur, and a Venusaur that doesn't actually focus on honey. It does honey and tomatoes. This is actually my situation. Now thankfully I have other specialties to cover for honey as well, but Venusaur is the main option for honey farming. So having tomatoes at level 30 when I actually need honey means that 2/3 of the ingredients produced, 4 tomatoes and 2 honeys every 2 productions, 60% are the stuff that I don't need. Now last I checked, there's not an ingredient finding stat that can increase ingredient finding by 60%. At best, if you have ingredient finding M plus F and then have nature, you need all of this ingredient stat up to only farm about half of what you would farm if you didn't have any ingredient stat but you have a mono ingredient honey. Bearing in mind it's actually better than 60% since honey is farmed 5 times whereas tomatoes actually only 4 times. Of course, if you actually needed the tomatoes, that wouldn't be a problem. It's just that the ratio of you needing honey and tomatoes are never going to be exactly 2 to 4, which is why you should build a mono ingredient team, and also which is why mono ingredient comes before even worrying about sub skills and natures. I can find more use in an ingredient finding down mono ingredient specialist than one that has all the right stats but doesn't farm the right ingredients. Now, one last problem about the mono ingredient meta is that some people argue that you'll need a good healer in order for this to work. Otherwise, if you have to end up swapping out a Beware that's farmed enough corn for, let's say, a Victory Bell so that you can start farming potatoes, but then at the end of the day, which team do you sleep with? Because you need to regenerate that energy. So if you didn't have a good healer, this will be a problem. Well, first of all, you should always have a good healer. So hunt a good healer. That's priority before anything else. But secondly, I would argue that you actually have more of this issue if you have mixed ingredient specialists. As I explained before, if you try to cook a Dream Eater butter curry, but you don't have the right ratio of potato and tomato, you can leave Victory Bell on your team as much as you like, but you're still going to be over farming potatoes compared to the tomatoes that you need. So you still end up switching out for something that can focus tomatoes and ultimately having this energy problem. So I don't think that's an issue at all. Hopefully I've managed to explain that concept well enough, and if I didn't, just refer to this chart. This is a good one. This chart will change over time when new ingredient specialists or ingredients get added to the game,